back.
We are now recording. So I did want to start with a land acknowledgement. I have never done a land acknowledgement. So I did some research, and hopefully this is respectful and appropriate. And I'm going to read it to you all. I would like to begin our session together this evening with a land acknowledgement. As I read this book in the comfort of my home and learned history that I never knew before, I had to ask myself, whose land am I living on? Using a search tool called Native Land, I respectfully acknowledge that I am living on the traditional territory of the Wichita, Tawakanee, Kickapoo or Kickapoo, and Humanos nations. I apologize if any of my pronunciations are incorrect. It is our intention this evening to speak with respect and honor towards all Indigenous nations as we learn more about our shared history so that we can be better allies and so that together we can build a better nation. Thank you. And Amy, I see you now. So before we get into some questions and answers with Jennifer. So for those of you who don't know, Jennifer LHAMAR is an Indigenous American, and she is going to answer some questions that I had given her in advance to help us kind of better understand what it is like being an Indigenous person in the United States, especially with our whitewashed history. But before we get to that, I know several of you read the book or read part of the book. And so Lauren and Amy, I would love to get your reactions, and Jennifer and Sarah, if you had a chance to look through the book. So I just would like to know, like, what surprised you? What stuck with you? How did it make you feel? So if anybody wants to jump in, I'd love to hear that.
I honestly feel really cheated and like mad about like what I haven't been taught by the time I'm 48 years old. Like, I can't believe, and I haven't finished the book, but just like some of the things that like I just didn't know. It also made me feel super ignorant. Like, how am I this ignorant at 48, and kind of embarrassed by that? But like mad at, like, I don't know, the education system, like whatever, like how whitewashed, like the history that I've been taught, and probably all of us have been taught, is. And I felt really weird celebrating Thanksgiving this year, I'll be honest. It felt really not right to me to be celebrating Thanksgiving for me personally. So I know that was a lot of feelings. Sorry.
No, I appreciate
I had a
it.
lot of feelings. Clearly.
Yes. Lauren?
Yeah, I'll confess, I also have not finished the book. I think I'm like 4 chapters from the end. But I'm also I was listening to it on Audible instead of reading it, and I just don't do that well that way, but that was the only way I could find the time to do it with this book at this period of time. So I feel like I need to go back, and I want to read it in text form again, because I feel like it's so dense with information.
Mm-hmm.
And nonfiction books are hard for me in general. I'm more of a fiction reader, but there's just so much that I felt like I was absorbing like 1/20th of the information that was being shared. But it really, like, it opened like my mind to want to know more about it. I'm not a huge fan of history in general. Only in my adult life have I started like learning more about it, because I can see how connected it was. I think in school growing up, it was just so like isolated from everything else I was learning. It just seemed like old, and why do we need to know that? And now, like, obviously as an adult, and with the social uprising that's been happening in the last 2 years, especially, it's just so obvious how much everything is interconnected and how ignorant I am about it. But I think in terms of your question, like what surprised me, I mean, so many things, but the thing that really like got to me in the beginning was sort of challenging this notion that I've always had of the, North America being sort of this vast open land ripe for the taking, with some people who were inhabiting it already, but not the like sort of massive and complex and well-defined cultures and communities that were here already. And I feel like not knowing that piece of Native history is like such a disadvantage, and such a like how we've, like you were saying, Amy, just how we've been cheated, and knowing this like rich culture, and just like feelings of guilt of not knowing that, and not looking at like the textbooks as the way we were taught it, and seeing like, of course there was more to that story, just being like complacent in that white history. So anyway, I feel like it was a starting point for me to learn more, and so much I need to go back and reread.
Yeah, it's 400 years of history, and she systematically goes through from kind of the East Coast to how we took over all the way across to the West Coast, covering every Indigenous nation. And to your point, one of the kind of the book club questions talks about the origin myth of the United States, right? So you talked about that it was this, what they said, virgin wilderness, right? There was hardly anybody here except, a handful of Indigenous people. And instead, what it talks about is that the Indigenous communities had civic and social organizations, cities with large populations, extensive trade networks. They had roads and trails and rivers that they used. And then they had this land management, right? So they had forests that they managed that had the deer populations. And then they had fields really with grain and grass, again, to do livestock management. And so we were taught one history, open wilderness, ripe for the taking, as you said, and this whole ignoring the fact that the entire continent was populated with millions of people. And so I think that was one of the biggest myths. So Lauren, that was one that definitely hit me. And it really is an origin myth. That we've been taught. We were talking about that earlier. The systemic education that we were given is lies. And then the frustration because of how politics today is playing out that wants to propagate and continue those lies. Because we don't want white people to feel bad. Right. Because, supposedly we can't handle that. So I think that's really, really frustrating. Any other facts? Oh, before I forget, so you talked about how dense this book was. So Lowry, one of our original founders of LHAMAR, is reading the young readers version with her daughter. And she said it has kind of sidebars and things to consider. So if you're struggling with this book, you might want to get the young readers version and go back through it. And I think I'm going to buy that for my kids, because like my teenager, I had read Cass because it's so readable, but I don't think I could get her through this book, but I think the young readers version would be good. So
that's the one
Sarah,
that I read.
Is that what you read?
Yeah, because that's the one that was available in the library. The other one came available later, but it was too late. And I didn't read it all the way through. I read probably the first 4 chapters and then kind of picked and chose through the rest of it. But I mean, what stands out to me is just how when you see the world through a white perspective, you are taught explicitly or implicitly that the white people's ways are the valid ways. Like, we discount the lived experiences and the knowledge and the historical background. We discount that because it's not European or white or Christian or, you know, whatever it is. And that's such a disservice to all of us, because we, you know, even thinking about, you know, Chinese medicine versus Western medicine, or, you know, it extends, you know, to all parts. But that is always a big thing for me with learning about Indigenous peoples, is that we just didn't care to learn about any of their wisdom, of the wisdom and knowledge that would have been so beneficial to us, like land management, forest management, those kinds of things. And, you know, white supremacy, colonialism is all about, we're going to come in and do things our way. And it's just such to the detriment of everybody, I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm in I can't remember which chapter it is, but I'm at the part where she's kind of walking through the idea of manifest destiny, and you know, the obvious contradiction of like settling a land to spread democracy and freedom and under this like banner of Christianity via the method of genocide, and how that very important latter part was just conveniently, you know, packaged and simplified and lied about, and like became such a small part of it. And the bigger part became, we're the like Americans, you know, who are spreading freedom, and that we feel entitled to go into other countries and try to do that as well. And just the whole like convoluted idea of how we have this like right to spread our ideals in the manner in which suits us best. It's hard to sit with.
It is. Well, what I'd like to do is do a Q&A with Jennifer. And if you have clarifying questions, or you want to jump in, since we're a small group, please feel free to do so. Jennifer has the right to say, I don't feel comfortable answering that question. So, Jennifer, I'm going to ask you to start off with background on what your Indigenous nation or nations are. And can you share some information about your nation? And you're on mute.
I keep forgetting about that. I'm so used to being on mute. So I actually made, it's not fancy, but it was enough to compile the information so I wouldn't forget certain things. If you'd like, if it's okay, could I share my screen with you guys?
Yes, please.
Okay.
If you know how to do that.
Right? If I forgot either. It says host disabled participant share screen sharing, which is fine.
Oh no, let me see if I can fix
you click on the little arrow next to where it says share screen, Yvette, it should pop up a menu, and you just say multiple participants can share.
Okay. Share content. Screen.
Not that one.
What?
Is there a little arrow next to?
There's an arrow that says share content, but I'm not seeing something that says, because Lowry made me a host.
But you might not have full hosting privileges.
Yeah, touch up, allow show meeting controls. Okay, let me try again. Sorry, y'all. Let me try one more. Meeting settings. I apologize, I cannot figure out, it's not giving me that option. So I think I don't have full control. I'm just able to let people in.
That's totally fine.
I'm so sorry, Jennifer.
It's okay. I can do without. No worries. So I am half Ojibwe and half Mexican. My dad's from Mexico. My mom is full blood Ojibwe from Canada, actually. And my legal name was Landeros Cabiosi. And if you saw Cabiosi, which was Ojibwe, no one knows how to pronounce it. It's very weird. And it's funny to think, because when I asked my mother when I was younger why it was spelled the way it was, at the time it used to be spelled as it read, with a K, but now it's spelled with a C. And I believe it had something to do with when the French was taking control over Canada. At some point when we tried to get on the US side, that's when they tried to translate in their own version, which doesn't make sense. And then as you can see, I recently got married in September, so my last name now is far more easier to deal with. And but my tribe is from Ontario, Canada. I am a registered member of the Sagamuk First Nation. And just a little side history with Canada is we don't like to be called Native Americans or obviously Indians. Our correct term is usually First Nations or Aboriginal. And so just to give some context of where this tribe is, this reservation is located, we're on the North Shore of Lake Huron. And our culture and language is Anishinaabeg, and it is made of Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi tribes.
Thank you. So did you grow up in Canada, or did you grow up in the United States, or a mix?
I actually was born and raised in Texas.
Okay.
Yes, my parents met in Texas back in the 80s, and then that's how I happened.
Okay. So I know that Canada has their own version of Thanksgiving Day in October. And of course, the United States, our Thanksgiving Day is in November. And then we have the infamous Columbus Day. So growing up with the background that you have, and even today, when Thanksgiving comes around, right? So Amy talked about like feeling bad this year about Thanksgiving or celebrating Thanksgiving. And then I know Columbus Day is a very frustrating day for Indigenous Americans. What was that like for you?
So it was interesting hearing y'all's feedback in regards to the book. And I'll be honest, I haven't read it. I have read some others. And one of the things that kind of strikes me most as I've grown older is when my mother was younger, it was actually shameful to be Native American. And I believe she carried that over into our generation, thinking that I was shameful of it. No one cares who we are. I don't feel it's not necessary for me to upkeep it and keep the culture alive in the family, whatever. I believe that generation was really shunned upon, along with the boarding schools that happened in Canada and here in America. And in fact, I do have relatives that have gone through that. And even when I ask them that, it's too painful for them to share. I can't imagine it, and nor I don't want to, but it is our history. It is what we had to deal with in those times. And so during that time that they were in Canada, my mother's two older brothers were actually basically snatched and taken away to these boarding schools. And I believe this is why they wanted to get away from Canada. They moved into Michigan in hopes that the rest of the kids wouldn't have to go through that. And with that brought trauma. It brought a sense of, we're not worthy. And then growing up, we didn't really get taught a lot of it in my home. Being in Texas, and then sharing a Hispanic culture, that was more so dominant in our home more than anything. And it wasn't that I was embarrassed of it either to be Native. It just, I grew up in Stephenville, Texas, literally cows, dairies, Republicans, the whole thing. I mean, it was like, I didn't get no diversity there. And going into school, I mean, it was mainly white, a lot of Hispanics, and a little bit of Black, and that was it. And when I was being taught in school of Native American history, I knew that it wasn't all that was being put in the textbook. Like, I knew there was a lot of it missing. But when you're like one out of like 1,000 students, you know, no one's going to really want to hear what you have to say. And so I've learned to just kind of like shut my mouth from it. It wasn't until I went to Dallas, when I came to Dallas and met a lot of Native friends, that's when I realized, wow, like, I feel like, and you know, part of my language, but I felt whitewashed my whole childhood. And I felt that I didn't get the necessary knowledge that I needed about my culture. I knew it was there in Canada, but I wasn't exposed to it. I didn't live on the reservation. I wasn't the typical Native American who grew up with these types of benefits people may think we have. And so now moving forward with Thanksgiving and Columbus Day, like, I don't see Thanksgiving at all associated with what a lot of people may see it as. I honestly see it as like, this is a time for me to really just only think of being grateful for friends and family and great food. And that's it. I don't see anything beyond that. And so Columbus Day is just as bad. Like, I don't even acknowledge the holiday at all. Even when I was little, I knew it wasn't something to like make a big deal out of, but the older that I've gotten, I really have no connection to it. And I honestly don't care.
Yeah.
You know.
Thank you. I think I've heard a lot of stories from immigrants, and I think this goes back to the colonial history of the United States, who their parents were first generation American, and therefore they refused to teach their children their native language. So whether they came from Vietnam or for other countries. And so I'm wondering, you know, for your parents' generation, for your mom, and for people that had this trauma with the boarding schools, if it was almost a way to thinking they were protecting their children by making them more white or more American, or not teaching that. And is that something you've run into as you've met other people that have Indigenous backgrounds, Jennifer?
Yes, because a lot of us are now trying to learn the language. And unfortunately, our parents, it's lost within them. I mean, even when my mother was a teenager, I remember her telling me that her mom would only speak to her in Ojibwe, but my mother would only respond back to her in English. And she was able to understand it, but it was already starting to like, I don't want to be associated with this. I mean, they got treated really bad up there, especially in Upper Peninsula, Michigan. It's definitely not a place I don't even want to live at in this day and age still. So yes, I do experience the same with my circle of friends who have gone through the same thing. And it's really sad, and it's a really big struggle because our elders they're passing away. It's just a cycle of life, and along with their language. And you know, especially in my case with Ojibwe, I need those people to connect with. Well, they're all the way up north. I don't have them here. A lot of them are the Texas and Oklahoma tribes, and while I respect them, they're not me, you know.
Right.
So yeah.
Thank you. So the next question I had is about stereotypes. So, you know, you talked about growing up in Stephenville, is that right?
Yes.
And so what is, you know, your experience or the experience of your friends about stereotypes about Indigenous Americans, which are hurtful and which are harmful?
Yeah, I think one of the big ones that actually ran through my childhood was alcoholism. My mom's parents abused it every day. Like she would remember waiting outside bars till their parents got done. And then when my mom became a parent, she didn't quite carry it on as bad, but it was enough for me to feel traumatized as a child. And I vowed that when I have my own children, that I would break the cycle, and I did. So unfortunately, the stereotype of alcoholism is strong, and it still is today, but not all of us are that way. A lot of us are really trying hard to break that cycle. And I won't lie, it's very difficult. It's very difficult.
Well, I think trauma breeds trauma, and the book talked about that introducing alcohol is one of the ways that religion, alcohol, and taking away language. And so trauma breeds trauma, right? So, if you have alcoholism in your family or abuse in your family, that is really hard to break. And I see that in my own family. So my father is an alcoholic. So I think that's very hard. And then knowing for the Indigenous Americans that were on reservations, that alcohol was, because they had nothing, that became a problem as well. And again, it's systemic, right? So was it a problem because it kept being provided? Was it being used as a mechanism for control? But it's interesting because I wouldn't have thought of it as a stereotype that everyone has that. But I can see how that would run through. Are there any other stereotypes that you ran up against, or like when somebody found out you were Indigenous American, or really in your case with the Canadian, a First Nation, were there names that they used, or were there things that they said that were hurtful, or did you more stay on the I'm Hispanic and not share that background?
I actually got more of I got teased more in the Hispanic, on my Hispanic side than my native side. Honestly, a lot of people thought I was just full Hispanic my entire childhood. It wasn't something that I had on my forehead that I'm Native American, but at the same time, no one really asked. But the only time it'd come up is like during class, and some random question would be brought about. But the whole mascot, sports teams things is a huge thing. I'm really glad that it's being, brought into light, because man, that's tough to see sports fans dress in headdresses, and it just, it bothers me in so many ways, and thinking that that's okay, or models, or, costumes, and it just associates our culture as a toy, and it's not. Especially for Halloween, it's one of the greatest, but one of the most irritating times of the year for us, because a lot of people will take advantage of that. Their time to shine as a native princess or whatever, and it's really insulting. So
yeah, I cringed. I saw someone had posted on Facebook about their Thanksgiving dinner, and then their toddler had, the band with the fake feathers, because in great, so even today, because when I grew up in the 80s, so I could probably be your parent.
You don't look it though.
Thank you.
Yeah, same. Right.
Yeah. So, I remember, it was common every Thanksgiving, you were either a pilgrim or you were an Indian, and you would make either the pilgrim hat, or you would make, the headband. And so when I saw that this Thanksgiving, I kind of cringed, like, really, still, and I think again, it's appropriation. I think it's ignorance. I don't, just like I think in the Japanese culture, you still see at Halloween, dressing up as geisha, or dressing up, so I think we still have a long way to go to respect other cultures in that. Yeah,
I went to I'm from Maryland, and the high school I went to, our mascot was Indians. and I graduated high school in 1991. I'm old. But I'm embarrassed to say that Franklin High School's mascot still in 2021 is Indians.
Mhm.
It's like, really? Like, certainly we can do better than this. We need to do better than this. I mean, I'm glad, like, with a lot of the professional sports teams and stuff that's changing, but I think it's a little slower in the, you know, secondary schools or maybe even elementary schools that have those mascots. Yeah. I cringe every time I get like the alumni newsletter, like from my high school, because, got a picture, of an Indian on the front cover, and I'm like, oh my gosh, really?
Yeah, it's tough. I will have to say, social media can bring a lot of bad, but in a sense, it can bring a lot of good at the same time. And I often tell my family that I was like, if it wasn't for social media, like where would we be today? Because I sometimes still can't believe some people actually think like we're a vanishing, race. And then when you get on social media and you see we're very much alive and we very much are proud of our culture and stuff, it makes it harder for us to feel respected when a school or a sports team still won't change their mascots, because then it allows the students and grown adults to behave how the way they behave, and it's almost like being knocked down again over and over. And it's just a never ending fight.
Yvette, are we allowed to ask questions?
You are, and Jennifer's allowed to not answer them if she's not
Of
comfortable.
course.
Yes.
I was just curious, with some of the, I don't know how you want to refer to it. I think I've mostly heard people say like benefits, although like really, that Indigenous people have in our country, and kind of like, have you heard people criticize that, like, oh, why do you get to go to college for free, or that kind of thing, or like the medical benefits? I mean, I know I have a really good friend who is, I don't remember what tribe his family is from, but I know he gets a lot of like criticism for that, and people saying like he shouldn't be entitled to that. And then I just think of like everything that we've taken from Indigenous people, and really, like, how can you criticize the things that maybe have been attempted to, like, make reparations? I
Mhm.
don't know if you feel comfortable talking about that at all, or your experience with that.
Yeah, I actually had that on my little list here. Was, we get a free ride from the government, which is not true.
Right.
Some get a lot more benefits than others. Honestly, every tribe is very different. In Canada, I was able to have my tuition paid for. However, it's not just given. I had to maintain a certain GPA. And every year I had to apply. It wasn't just something, oh, you're good to go for 4 years and that's it. I do know family members who have that benefit and they don't take it. They just go on with their lives without it. The downside somewhat is there's a local kind of a clinic for Native Americans in the US. And I remember telling a Native friend of mine I was not feeling well, this or that. And she's like, well, just go to this place, show them your card, and you should be able to get in like that. So I called them and I said, well, I'm registered in the Canadian tribe though. And they said, well, we don't accept it. And I'm like, what? I was like, it's like North America, like what's the difference? But they had their rules. And I mean, even my son, who is 1/4 Ojibwe now, I applied for his Indian status card in Canada, and that paperwork was off the charts. I mean, I was more nervous doing that than anything in my life. It was just so much stuff they asked for, and it's honestly, looking back at it, it's ridiculous. I mean, my mom's status is there, I'm status there, and they denied him after like 4 to 5 months of going through this. They denied him outright. I can't get status for him, so he won't be able to have his tuition paid for, so he's going to be I'm like thinking, how is it that I could be in 1/2 but he can't be 1/4? So there's a lot of ups and downs to it and everything, and unfortunately most people think we get a free ride, and all of us don't have that opportunity.
Sounds a little bit like discrimination in the opposite way. So a lot of what we read about in the United States history for Black people is if you had 1 drop of Black blood, you're Black. But to get benefits as a First Nations or an Indigenous American, it's like you have to have more.
Yeah.
And I've heard that. It sounds like that's your experience.
Yeah, I remember when I applied for my son, I don't remember who I was talking to. And it honestly sounded like she was like, well, good luck getting that approved, because the Canadian government just doesn't want to accept these applications. They don't want no one to be Indigenous because they don't want to give out the benefits to them. And so I was like, well, that's tough to hear. I was like, okay, so, but I did it. And that was hard. Get the letter months later, and then all for them to tell me he can't get it. So
Are you gonna try again later? Like
it
seems like yeah.
No, I want to, but the silly thing about it as well is my cousin was born in 1985, I believe, and I was born in 1986. So I'm revealing my age. But the reason why I'm mentioning this is because Canada passed a law, I believe it was in September of 1985. Anybody who was born before that, and if their kids were 1/4, then they can get it. So my cousin's children who are 1/4 can get it. But because I was born after September 1985, my children can't. So there's this division that they've created that's
interesting.
Yeah, it was
and hurtful. I hope they change it, because I think I have some people I know in Canada, and it seems like they have been doing more work with reparations than the United States has. So I would keep pushing that, but
yeah.
But yeah, it just makes it more hurtful.
Yeah.
On top of that. So earlier, I think you used the word tribe, and that was one of my questions. Is a lot of times I hear non-Indigenous people saying, well, you're part of my tribe, or I found my tribe. And I wanted to know from your perspective and the perspective of the community, is it okay for non-Indigenous people to use the word tribe, or is that disrespectful?
I do believe it is disrespectful, in my personal opinion. Now, I'm not sure of all natives, though. However, I was doing some digging around and understanding how other natives felt. So, they had noted the fact that there are over 574 federally recognized American Indian and Alaska Native tribes and villages. So for Indigenous people, tribal identity is important. So when a non-Native people or person says, find your tribe or tribe to describe groups of shared interests, it is offensive because it erases the significance of tribal sovereignty, identity, and the people. So instead, use words like group, crew, friends, circle. I mean, it's still just as effective. So when using the word tribe, it's a colonial construct that was used to marginalize Native Americans, and its continued use by non-Indigenous people fails to accurately recognize their history and unique status as tribal nations. So
yeah,
there are ways to see it differently.
Okay, because the book seemed to use nation more than tribe. And I think also recognizing how big the populations were. So related to using the word tribe, a lot of times people will say spirit animal, Like, you know, there'll be some funny video or something about a particular animal or somebody doing something, and they'll go, oh, you're my spirit animal. So is that considered similar to tribe? Is that considered disrespectful? Is that something from a religious perspective that should be preserved for Indigenous people?
I'm not a fan of it, because I think a lot of people who are non-Indigenous tend to think we all have a spirit animal, and we don't. Actually, sometimes it's assigned to us through elders. And in my case, for instance, before COVID, I had inquired to one of my older relatives, I'm interested in becoming a jingle dancer. And I just can't become one because I am Native. I have to go through elders to get my colors, to get my name, to, you know, be able to be kind of accepted into moving forward to the next step. So it isn't as easy as it comes. And so when somebody refers to it like we all have one or so, it's just not the appropriate term to say. Now, if somebody said it around me or so, I mean, it's like, it's not as offensive. I just kind of like roll it off and whatnot. But as I had read too, that, you know, spirit animal is characterized as a teacher or a messenger that comes in the form of an animal. It is not a novelty. Native American spirit animals are incredibly sacred and hold a sacred place in many tribal cultures around the world. So not just us, but, you know, African tribes to South American to whomever, everything, you know.
Yeah, thank you. So my last couple of questions are, how can non-Indigenous people be better allies? And is there anything you would like allies to know? So like, you say you're an ally, but you keep doing this, knock it off.
Yeah.
Right. So how can we do better, Jennifer?
I think that one of the top three things is acknowledge, educate, and then celebrate. You got to acknowledge the history of this. I mean, it's pretty hardcore. I mean, obviously a book alone can impact one's way of thinking of everything they were taught their whole childhood to now. You know, and then becoming educated in the topic itself. You know, it's a very, very lengthy history that unfortunately just wasn't taught in our school books. And I think it's almost like we have to uneducate to be educated in that perspective. And then also just celebrating the fact, like, you know, why is it so hard for us to have a day for us without complaining about it? You know, it's like we have all these wonderful holidays to acknowledge, but, you know, why not make it Indigenous Peoples Day, take over Columbus Day, and no one throw a fit about it? I don't understand that, you know. So it's harmless in my opinion, but and that's just how I think of it. You know, when you celebrate, even when attending a powwow, if a friend brings you or so, I mean, just enjoy being in their presence and fully just acknowledging how they share their culture. And most times, I mean, I've never been to a powwow where one was non-invited. I mean, we're always welcoming people and we're very funny. So people often think we carry this really serious thing on our face and stuff, but we're very humorous people and we're very welcoming. You know, so I hope the next time I can share a powwow event that, you know, some of y'all can join in, because it really is a beautiful thing to watch. And unfortunately, I haven't experienced it in Canada on my reservation, but I do go to them very often here in the DFW area. In fact, if it goes well with COVID not canceling it, the University of Texas at Arlington typically has a big one in February.
Okay.
So there'll be upcoming news about that if they continue forward with it.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing and for doing some additional research. I really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, it's been so helpful, and helps me understand more from what was in the book, kind of like your current experiences
Yeah.
based on this history.
Yeah.
So before I go back to the book, does anyone have any other questions or anything that kind of popped up as Jennifer was sharing?
I have a question. I actually have two, if I'm allowed. One is, I know at the beginning you addressed sort of preferred and non-preferred language. If I am not mistaken, and ladies who read the book, correct me, I thought in the beginning, in the intro, the author stated that through her research, she found people saying that Indian was not an offensive term. And I may have misheard that because, again, I was listening on Audible, so I couldn't go back and, look it up. But I have been, now conditioned to steer clear of using that terminology. So I just wanted to check if I misheard that, if anyone else caught that, or Jennifer, if you could just maybe, if you wouldn't mind again saying what words or terminology is comfortable and what is not preferred.
Yeah, not a problem. Mostly Native American or American Indian is preferred. I mean, it's going to happen. We understand some people kind of pause and freak for a second because they're like, oh God, I don't want to say anything bad. So Indian, that's the first thing that comes out of their mouth. Most times we tend to not take offense to it, but if it's said in a very, malicious way, then yes, of course. But most times we always make a joke of it because, we're like, we're not that Indian. We're not the dot, we're the feather and everything. So, so we just don't like to have people confuse us with another country in a sense, their own people.
Gotcha. And what term do you yourself prefer for people to refer to you as?
Native.
Native. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Good to know. I do feel like sometimes I feel like inhibited in how I can move forward because of the language. So I feel like if I have a clear understanding, it helps to move forward.
Yeah.
My second question, if you don't mind me asking, and again, you may not know of it or you might not feel comfortable talking about it, but how are you feeling about things like, I don't know if you know the show Reservation Dogs? Do you know this TV?
I've heard of it, yeah, and I haven't seen it. It's not that I'm not interested to, but I just don't have the time. But I would love to watch it with my son though.
My understanding is it's been well received, and I think it was written created by Native.
Yeah, it has. Some of my Native friends have watched it and commented on Facebook, and they're like, "You got to watch it," kind of thing. It's great. So yeah, it's been well received.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
We've only watched a few episodes of it, but I really enjoyed it because I feel like I've learned so much, like small pieces of culture that I would have a really hard time learning about without any exposure to Native people myself, which unfortunately I just don't have that much exposure to.
Yeah.
So for me, things like that, the show and a couple of books I've read, but I always want to make sure it's a good representation or a well-received representation.
Yeah. I've heard nothing but good things about it.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. It's been
of
really
course. Thank you for your question.
hearing you.
Thank you, Lauren. So the author, Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, wrote in the book about kind of the history of the United States. So I want to read you this quote and then ask y'all a question. We'll probably end with your thoughts on that. It says, neither superior technology nor an overwhelming number of settlers made up the mainspring of the birth of the United States or the spread of its power over the entire world. Rather, the chief cause was the colonialist settler states' willingness to eliminate whole civilizations of people in order to possess their land. Jefferson was the architect of the colonization of North America. Andrew Jackson was the implementer of the final solution to the indigenous peoples east of the Mississippi. And I shivered again when I read that, because if you hear final solution, it may make you think of Nazi Germany and the final solution used against the Jewish people. But again, Germany studied the history of the United States, both our laws for African Americans, and then how we eliminated the Native Americans in the country. And so she wrote that quote, and then the question, the book club question is, how do we as a nation talk about or not talk about the death marches, the ethnic cleansing, the physical and cultural genocide? So Jennifer spoke to the boarding schools, which was the cultural genocide. I'm going to take away your culture and whitewash you, or physically, I'm just going to wipe you out. The theft of the land and other racist policies and actions. So, right, so the United States kept putting laws on the books that basically made it almost illegal to be a Native American. And then even though they had treaties with the nations, they kept breaking the treaties and taking that land away. So how do we talk about it? Because obviously none of us learned this in school. So how do we talk about it? How do we talk about it with our children? And how do we move forward? I know those are really big, hard questions. But if any of you have thoughts on that, I'd love to hear it as we end tonight. Amy's like, I worked until almost 8 o'clock and then jumped on book club, and now you're asking me this question.
Well, I mean, I just feel like not just on this subject matter, but in so many other ways, I know that what my child's 11, he's in 6th grade, what he learns in school is gonna have to be supplemented by us at home so that he can learn, quote unquote, a lot of the real history of our country. And I think especially as a white parent, like, I feel an incredible responsibility to teach him, you know, how we have subjugated people of other races. Because I think if we don't teach, you know, our kids' generation better than what we were taught, you know, how can we move forward and do better? And I don't at all view it, you know, like, I know some white people that's very threatening to them, and, oh, we shouldn't make our kids feel guilty about being white. To me, it has nothing to do with that. But I want him to understand, like, the full history, the complete history, not just the parts of it that seem pleasant to, you know, talk about. I'm okay with, like, having those uncomfortable conversations. I mean, I'm a social worker. I do uncomfortable for a living. So that's just kind of how I feel like I'm going to have to not just leave it up to the public school system to educate him about the things that I think are important for him to know. Yeah.
Thank you.
I think that one thing that gives me hope is I was a high school teacher for a long time, and so I follow a lot of my former students on social media. And I think one benefit of social media is that people are exposed to so many different ideas and people and backgrounds, and much more than we were ever exposed to, right? Like, I read all the Little House on the Prairie books, and now, you know, see how problematic they were because they just presented that one viewpoint. I wasn't exposed to all of these other things. But I think that one benefit of our world now, two-edged sword, of course, but is that young people do get exposure to a wide variety of ideas and are able to make decisions that are much more informed than I feel like I had. Yvette and Amy, I'm your age, so Jennifer, you're the youngin. But so I think that is one benefit. But then also, yeah, we have to educate ourselves as parents, and then also, you know, like Amy was saying, share that with kids too, for sure.
I think one of the things in the book that she touched about towards the very end is obviously all of the land in the United States belonged to the Indigenous Americans, and much of the land that was taken, or areas of the land, are sacred, like the Black Hills Territory. And so I think one of the things that I want to be more aware of is where there are actions going on to support giving land back, especially federal lands, instead of like selling them to private people to destroy, where there are opportunities to support giving lands back, or again, voting for politicians and knowing what their views are. I just, was on cruise control for probably the first 45 years of my life on like who I voted for, because again, I was very ignorant. And so I think, again, educating our children so that they can do better. But I still have a responsibility to be aware of actions that are going on, or petitions, right? So, all these pipelines, that's a big area and concern. Fracking on reservation lands, so I think for me, number one, educating and teaching accurate history and advocating for that and doing the best I can with my children. But I think number two is being involved politically. And I don't know about y'all, but I'm exhausted with being involved politically. But I think that we have to continue to advocate and to research and to not just think, oh, well, that person's a good candidate, but to really understand that and to look for those actions and to look for those petitions. Because even though I'm in Texas, if something is happening in North Dakota and I can make an impact, then I should try to make an impact. So I think that that's something else for us to be looking at. Any other last minute thoughts anyone wants to share, Lauren?
Yeah, I was just going to say, you guys may well already know this book, but Howard Zinn's A Young People's History of the United States is so great for teaching younger kids a non-whitewashed history of the United States. So in terms of looking for things to supplement what your kids are learning at school, if you don't already have that book, I would highly suggest it. And I love knowing that there's a young people's guide to this book as well, because maybe that will be a slightly less dense way for me to digest, this just treasure trove of information. I mean, sad and heart-wrenching information, but there's just so much to it. So I think, just having that ongoing conversation with our kids about real history. And I think what was crazy for me growing up is there was such a dissociation when I read about history and things that happened to people, like the Trail of Tears. Of course, we learned that, but it didn't sink into my mind that those were real people with their own children and their own families and their homes, all the things that made them real people that would make me compassionate about that history. So as a parent, I'm trying to very much be like, that's a real person we're talking about. The Jewish people in Nazi Germany were real people who were terrified. People on the Trail of Tears were real people. I feel like just trying to make that connection of humanity in the history that we're learning that can so easily feel not important or interesting for kids.
Yeah, I think that's important.
I hated history in school because it just felt like it was just like regurgitating all these names and dates and just like, well, at the time, what I thought were facts, but maybe, put that in quotes now. But it didn't seem to like really, and I think Lauren might have said this earlier, like it didn't relate to like, they didn't like relate to like other things I was learning. I don't feel like you learn like the cultural impact of history or like what else was going on in the world, like when you're learning about, World War I, World War II, like these big events. And there wasn't a lot of like connecting the dots for me. It was just like learn these names, learn these dates, learn these facts, and spit it all up on a test. And it was just so like just mind-numbing to me. It just wasn't, I don't know, it wasn't about, like Lauren said, like humanity and like learning about real people. And I mean, they were real people, obviously historical figures, but there was no like really human connection, at least for me, like what I was learning in my history classes. And I just absolutely dreaded, I just dreaded history. And now as an adult, you know, history is something that I love learning about. And going back and like, you know, re-educating myself about so many things that, you know, I just learned enough to like spit up the stuff on the test, but I didn't really absorb like the history and the humanity of it and the cultural and societal and all of the other stuff that went along with it.
I think a lot of education today, unfortunately, because we're focusing on testing. And I think the other thing with history, back to systemic racism, is if, you know, the first step to genocide is dehumanizing, right? We've seen that used over and over and over again. So if you make history real and you make what colonialists did globally, you know, whether it was Spain or England or whomever, if you humanize the people that were destroyed, then, you know, you're putting down the white race. And so I think in America, you've got a whitewashed version of it, and then it is taught in a way that is not particularly interesting. Now, I have had some history, like not all my history teachers, but I have had some history teachers that really were amazing, and I learned a lot more from them. But I think when we look at especially what's happening in Texas right now, I mean, a lot of teachers are leaving because they're being forced to be put in a box of what they can and can't teach, or because they're having to teach to a test. And so they're not really able to go very deep. And so I think it does fall upon parents to, if the schools aren't going to be allowed to teach or given enough time, right? Like there's not enough time to really get deep. And Sarah, you might have thoughts as a former teacher or a not currently teaching teacher. There's never really, my mom's a retired teacher, she's still teaching. So I'd love to know your thoughts on that, but I feel like it does fall on parents. And if parents haven't been taught, then they don't even realize that they need to teach their kids accurate history, because, you know, look at how indignant we are when we're actually finally learning.
I work with teachers now. So I coach beginning teachers and I teach them classes. They're in a master's program. And so I do work with teachers in the classroom, and I work in Dallas ISD schools and Uplift charter schools. And in Uplift in the elementary, they have adopted a new social studies curriculum that is not accurate enough, in my opinion. So a big part of our program is that we're training teachers to work in urban classrooms with in schools that have a high teacher turnover rate, and we want to equip our teachers with the skills and knowledge to work with the populations that are in their classrooms and be effective. So we talk a lot about culturally relevant teaching, making sure that you are making connections for your students to the material, and making sure that they see themselves in the material. And with history, especially, first of all, social studies usually isn't taught because it's not tested. And so when it is taught, it's, you're given 20 minutes twice a week to teach social studies. But if your math block runs over, then sorry, social studies, because math is tested, right? It's a very interesting world. And I started teaching right when No Child Left Behind was begun. And so my whole teaching career has been under the testing banner. But it is too bad. I think that, yeah, what you guys were saying about what's taught in schools is not enough, for sure. We all know that. We can all say that, especially when it comes to history and social studies, K through 12. There definitely has to be more done at home outside of school, even if kids aren't very interested by it, I think. But yeah, for sure. It's the testing aspect does take over everything, unfortunately. I wish we could swing back, but we're not quite there yet.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for being here. Jennifer, thank you so much for trusting us and sharing background. If you have that document, if you're comfortable with me posting that on the LHAMAR website, or if you want to clean it up to post it, I would love to post that so other people can read it. I know you spent a lot of time on it and I really appreciate it.
Yeah, of course, absolutely. Do you prefer email or?
You can email or you can send it to me in Messenger.
Okay.
If it lets you have an attachment, or I can send you my email. So whatever works.
Got it. I'll attempt the messenger first, and if not,
Okay.
then yes, I'll email you.
Yeah. Thank you again. Thank you all for being willing to be recorded. As Brene Brown would say, thank you for being awkward, brave, and kind. And with that, have a great evening, and we will see you all later.
All right,
Thank you.
so much.
Thank you for your work
Thank
too.
you.
So
Thank
welcome.
you.
Thank y'all for having me. All right, bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.